Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico 26, Comanches 1, Small Beginnings. Pekka Hamalian starts his book, The Comanche Empire, with the following quote, "This is a book about an American empire that, according to conventional histories, did not exist. It tells the familiar tale of expansion, resistance, conquest, and loss. Both are a reversal of the usual historical roles. It is a story in which Indians expand, dictate, and prosper, and European colonists resist, retreat, and struggle to survive." And before I picked up this text, this episode was mostly going to follow the traditional narrative on the Comanches. While they were a major thorn in the side of the Spanish, especially in the mid to late 1700s, they were eventually brought to the table due to the Spanish having access to manufactured goods that the Comanches didn't. Spanish then used this economic leverage to control the Comanches, bringing them into the Spanish sphere of influence. From there, I was going to compare them to the Navajo, as both being regional powers, one able to maintain its independence in the face of pressure from colonial interests, and the other unable to, introduced as part of a larger sphere. But when you look at the Comanches' dealings and actions in the larger frontier region, and not just in New Mexico, that narrative doesn't really hold up to snuff. I also quickly realized one episode alone wouldn't be enough to cover everything I want to talk about regarding the Comanches up to 1821, which is what this episode and the next will cover. Their origins as a bit player on the edge of the Spanish world to a regional empire that could treat on equal terms with colonial powers. While future episodes will be closer to this traditional narrative, focusing less on the Comanches and what they were up to, and rather on how the Spanish and later Mexican governments interacted and interpreted these interactions with the Comanches. The next few episodes on the Comanches will really focus on them as an imperial power and kind of look at it through that lens compared to the traditional narrative. Like many episodes from this time period in New Mexico, and I suspect those going forward, is no longer just about a small colony on the far northern Spanish frontier, but is about how that small Spanish colony fits into the larger world and interacts with those that surround it. The Comanches were a group that splintered off from the Shoshone sometime in the late 1600s, heading south and crossing into the Front Range of Colorado. The exact reason for this split is unclear. Could have been due to disease and pressure from the Apaches, who were building their own sizable power base on the or it could have been due to one group wanting to maintain access to Spanish horses. Either way, the Comanches would form an alliance with the Utes, one of many long-standing alliances they would form. At first, they provided military support to the Utes, who in turn helped them come to understand the situation on the Spanish frontier. During this time in the early 1700s, that they reinvented themselves and adapted to life on the frontier. Their springs were spent on the plains, and their summers would be spent raiding or warring, and the rest of the year would be hunting in the mountains. They shared many similarities with their close neighbors, the Utes, during this time. Different Comanche bands did live differently. Here is where three broad divisions of Comanches begin to appear: the Yamparicas, the Cotsotecas, and the Hoop. It is during this time that they enter into the Spanish record as the Numunu, starting with the first records appearing in 1706. It could be argued that 1706 marks the beginning of one of the bloodiest migrations and conquests in the recorded history of the Southwest, with the only one that could possibly top it being the later American conquest of what would become the American Southwest. The political situation in the Southwest was what really gave the Comanches the opening they needed. You have the French pushing into the Mississippi, the Spanish are pushing into Texas, and the Apaches are kind of consolidating their power on the plains. This gave the Comanches various different groups that they would be able to deal with and play off of each other for their own advantage, whatever that advantage at the time may be. It also let them play off of whichever one was weak at the time as well for their own gain. Another change was also occurring on the plains during this time. French, British, and later Americans were starting to make inroads into the continent, and unlike the Spanish, these powers were more willing to trade certain European goods to native tribes they encountered, namely guns. Horses and steel were also beginning to spread across the plains. These three technologies would radically change the balance of power for the plains tribes, but also their ways of life. Of these, the horse was probably the most monumental. The horse made the world smaller, allowing people to move more goods further at a faster pace than the dogs that were traditionally been used as beasts of burden on the plains. By 1710, the Comanches were making raids on New Mexican towns. But it wasn't all violence. The Comanches and their Ute partners would integrate themselves into the emerging slave trade on the plains, and they quickly established themselves on the supply side of this market. Carlina and Jicarilla Apaches were their main targets, but Pawnees and Navajos could also be captured and sold to New Mexicans when the opportunity arose. It did not take long in the early 1700s for the Ute-Comanche alliance to become a major force in northern New Mexico. The raiding would quickly reach a point where the far northern frontier had begun to disintegrate. Settlements would be abandoned, some of the remaining settlements were suspected of betraying the Spanish, and the horse herds would be so devastated and depleted that the governor would have to beg the Viceroy of Mexico for more horses. This raiding was also highly localized. Often the Comanches treated individual settlements as different autonomous groups rather than part of one larger nation. This would allow for them to raid one town one day and trade in the next town the next day. It also may have better described the actual situation on the ground than the idealized Taos as part of New Mexico. Well, yes, it on paper was. It may have dealt more independently than, say, Socorro, or in Santa Fe was treated differently than, say, Pecos. Luckily for New Mexicans, during the 1720s and 1730s, the alliance would shift its focus east, starting a long, drawn-out war with the Plains Apaches. This war was a natural extension of the existing slave raids, now just prolonged and to acquire resources. During the 1600s and first decade of the 1700s, some of the Apaches had adopted a more sedentary agricultural lifestyle, creating small villages along the river valleys found on the southern plains. This war against the Apaches by the Utes and the Comanches was over two things: access to these river valleys and access to the New Mexican markets. Put simply, there was no longer enough room on the plains for both ways of life, nomadic and semi-nomadic, to coexist. The semi-sedentary economy the Apaches had created became a military disadvantage, tying the Apaches to these villages that are located in one place. Comanches could focus on isolated villages thanks to their mobility and annihilate or raid them. The Apaches were also plagued with infighting among the different groups, whereas the Comanches and Utes put up a more united front, and this further undermined Apache power on the plains. The Comanches also used their mobility to upset Apache trade, such as attacking New Mexican trade fairs during Apache visits. Other groups monopolized the French trade from the Apaches, basically the entire Apache trade network collapsed, and left them weakened both for Comanche attack, but also from attack from other rivals from other directions. The situation would get so bad that at least some of the Jicarilla Apaches would flee to Taos, seeking protection from the Spanish in exchange for conversion to Catholicism, an offer the Spanish would accept. The goal was to use the Apaches as a shield against the Utes and Comanches, and possibly the French. We'll see this idea come back a lot in future episodes of trying to establish a buffer between the core Spanish regions, be that New Mexico or areas further south, and everything surrounding the Spanish. Either way, Governor Valverde would lead an expedition in fall of 1719 of some 600 troops. On the way, the Spanish would meet the displaced Apache refugees. However, they would not encounter the Comanches, who had sacked El Cuartelejo, a major seat of Apache power on the plains. They would also hear reports that the French were moving into the plains. The French presence would actually prove a boon, as it redirected Spanish attention away from the Apache situation to focus on the French situation. The Spanish would debate further action among the Apaches, but eventually they would be left to their fate. By 1723, the Apaches had lost the Arkansas Valley to the Comanches. After this loss, the Apaches offered not only conversion to Catholicism, but to live in pueblos in exchange for Spanish aid. Just about everything the Spanish could wish for. In November of 1723, Juan Domingo de Bustamante rode out to inspect La Jicarilla. The Comanches, alarmed by the potential for a Spanish-Apache alliance, stormed La Jicarilla in January 1724. They besieged the settlement for 4 days. This set the Spanish back to discussing if they should support the Apaches or not. It allowed the Comanches to keep pressuring the Apaches through to the 9-day battle at El Gran Sierra del Fierro in the Texas Panhandle. Thus beaten, anything south of the Canadian was abandoned by the Apaches. The decision not to build the colony near La Jicarilla was a pivotal event in the Apaches. The decision had fallen to Brigadier General Pedro de Rivera, who had found New Mexican Indian policy lacking, and he had been trying to cut costs on the Indian policy. He had determined that New Mexico was too thinly spread to support the effort of establishing a colony among the Apaches. The Comanche Ute territories now stretched from the upper Arkansas Valley to the Cimarron River, from the Sangre de Cristo Mountains to roughly the 98th meridian. They had yet to fully embrace horses, and dogs were still partially used, but they now had so many horses that they had to break into smaller bands of extended family, which would become the basic social unit of the Comanches. They did not ride this momentum into further expansion, though. For the time being, their needs had been met. Instead, they would set to work filling in the trade void that the Apaches had previously occupied in New Mexico. This trade would offer New Mexico a brief reprieve from Comanche raids during the 1730s. However, changes were coming to Comanche society. Increasingly, violent external action was needed for internal social mobility. By the end of the 1730s, an entire generation had matured with no military record. This caused them to push south, warring with the Apaches once again. This conflict was partly fueled by the need for military records to grow one's prestige, the never-ending need for slaves to trade, and the need for more territory to pasture horses. This time, when the Apaches looked to New Mexico for aid, they were met with disinterest, other than allowing refugees to mass around Spanish settlements. This, as well as restricting Pueblo trade with the Plains tribes that disrupted the food supply to the Plains, would set the Spanish on a collision course with the Comanches. To the Comanches, trade was a way to seal attachments and create social or political networks, unlike the Spanish, where it was a way to exchange goods in hopes of monetary gain. One issue with these two incompatible views of trade was that it meant the Spanish regularly broke Comanche social norms when trade between the two groups did occur, further escalating tensions between them. By the early 1740s, these tensions would break into outright hostility. In 1746, the governor learned Taos may have been supplying the Comanches with information. This would lead to a ban of the Comanches from the trade fairs, which would only escalate the situation. In 1747, the Spanish would attack a combined camp on the Chama River. Not only were the Spanish making gains, the Pawnee and Arapahoes were pressuring the Comanches from the north. In the east, the Osages, backed by the French, pressed the Comanches. This was one of their most critical hours. The Comanches would reconfigure their political strategy to allow them to maneuver out of this crisis. In quick order, they fashioned an alliance network that stabilized the northern and eastern border. In 1746, they formed an alliance with the Tauveyas, the only Wichita tribe still located in the middle Arkansas Basin. This allowed for both forces to combine to push back the Osages. It also provided a market where the Comanches could buy iron tools, guns, gunpowder, and food. This trade deal was also the beginning of turning this region into a trade avenue. In 1748, the Spanish were concerned to learn the French were near Taos trading with the Comanches. The trade with the French was so extensive that eventually, due to the number of Apache slaves in Louisiana, it became difficult for the French to maintain their alliance with the Apaches. These alliances also allowed the Comanches to reverse course in New Mexico. By 1748, the Spanish were forced to reinstate the trade fair privileges, and Governor Cachupin made the Comanche the number one priority of the colony. The Spanish understood that New Mexico was on much shakier ground now that the Comanches were friendly to the French. It was a delicate situation. Pushing the Comanches away brought them closer to the French. War was ill-advised because of economic and political reasons, such as the trade. Overall, Governor Cachupin tried to offer better deals at the trade fairs to entice them away from the French. And I want to take a second to talk about these trade fairs. The recorded brutality of the Comanches to captured slaves, such as public rape, served to show the Spanish what a captive woman could expect should the Spanish not pay a ransom. This allowed the Spanish to, in their minds, legitimize the trade for the Spanish. By 1751, the Comanches were demoralizing the Spanish. Cachupin would win a devastating victory against the Comanches by trapping them in a box. He would kill 112 of them and capture a further 33. He would keep 4 women of these 33 as hostages and release the rest to open negotiations. With the first formal peace talks, the Spanish had to learn more about how the Comanches worked, revealing a sophisticated system with a clear hierarchy, procedures for broadly inclusive decision-making, and effective communication systems. The Comanches called a council and discussed peace. There were some pain points in the negotiations, such as the return of captured Spanish captives to, well, the Spanish. Eventually, though, the Comanches would decide on peace. In 1752, several chiefs visited, sealing closer ties between the two groups. The delegation was sent home with gifts and the 4 captive women. The process of peace was tenuous, though, due to continued raids. Final peace was very favorable to the Comanches. In agreement for a cessation of raiding, they received several concessions, including unrestricted access to the Taos and Pecos trade fairs. Cachupin also issued a diplomatic protocol that catered to Comanche sensibilities. The governor effectively became a mediator between the Comanches and New Mexicans. Peace recognized the Comanches as a sovereign nation, something the Spanish denied many smaller indigenous societies. This would become a precedent other nations would follow after the Spanish. Cachupin also understood that peace needed to constantly be reaffirmed. He advised future governors to attend trade fairs to do so. He also had other advice for settlers during trade fairs that better matched Comanche preferences. He also cut Spanish support to the Apaches and convinced some of them to relocate to the area around Pecos. This left the Llano Estacado open to the Comanches. The rest of the Apaches migrated south to Texas. By the 1750s, their alliance with the Tauveyas led to an alliance with the Pawnees, securing their northern border. All 3 nations in this alliance felt threatened by the Osages. In 1751, they dealt a critical blow to the Osages. Comanche-Skiddy alliance was marred by hostilities, though. In 1757, the Tauveyas, who bore the brunt of the Osage attacks, collapsed, and they fled to the Red River. The Comanches would manage to hold out and turn their borders to the Osages into a no-man's land. This would last well into the 19th century, and U.S. Army officials would note of its existence as late as the 1830s. The peace in New Mexico also led to a collapse of the Comanche-Ute alliance. Things would change across the borderlands, such as the French and Indian War. New governors and other events would lead to open conflict. The signs were there in 1749. The Utes asked for military support against the Comanche and would open their own peace talks with the Spanish. By the end of 1752, Spanish sources indicated there had been clashes. War with the Apaches and Spanish had been the glue that held the alliance together. Access to New Mexican markets was the main pain point. The Utes had also never fully committed to life on the plains, unlike the Comanches. The alliance network on the plains also meant that there was less need for a Ute alliance with the Comanches. In short, by making themselves a key player in the unfolding events on the plains, the Comanches increasingly set themselves on a diverging trajectory from the Utes. As he left, Cachupin would leave the following advice to his successor. Quote, permit their familiarities and take part in their fun at suitable times. Sit down with them and command tobacco for them so they may smoke, as is their custom. End quote. In 1754, the new governor, Francisco Marin del Valle, did not have the same grasp of diplomacy with the Comanches and failed to heed this advice, causing the peace to unravel. Thus, raiding began anew. The Spanish would form an anti-Comanche coalition with the Utes and the Apaches. Affairs remained open, though. The borderland conflict that grew was complicated and confusing, and what made an enemy or ally was blood. In 1761, a captured 9-year-old Spanish boy refused to leave his Comanche. The fallout of this event turned into a catastrophe. Comanches fled, and the Utes, fighting with the Spanish, looted their camp. The Spanish pursued and slaughtered the fleeing warriors. Quote, according to Comanche social code, a man's honor depended on his ability to protect and expand his kinship network, and losing one's wife or children to enemies was a source of unbearable shame, resulting in a loss of masculine respect. Such a loss brought social stigma that could only be removed by retrieving relatives, by replacing them with the captors, women and children, or by symbolically covering the dead with enemy bodies. Massive grief and loss, in other words, demanded retribution, and there would be retribution against the Spanish. But it was this mess that Cachupin would return to for his second term in 1762. He had released some captives as a sign of goodwill. The Comanches, learning of his return, decided to send a delegation. They came with crosses and rifles, showing they were willing to talk peace or war. Cachupin recognized some of them, showing that institutional positions of leadership existed. He listened to their grievances, responded with remorse, and laid out his peace proposal. He would restore their trading privileges and suggested both sides release their captives. Both of these were the key causes of this conflict. Quote, anticipating a profound shift in Spanish Indian policy in the 1780s, Cachupin had realized that peace with Indian nations depended on gifting and personal bonds rather than institutional ties. It required yielding dreams of cultural supremacy to the reality of cultural accommodation and exchange. And Comanches also compromised, assenting to the fiction of vassalage to the king. They also seemed to have accepted that New Mexico was not a group of autonomous settlements, that they could have different contradictory relationships, at least for the time being. They refrained from the raiding and trading practice for several years. It also sealed the Spanish on the Comanche side, rather than the Ute side. The Utes retreated from the plains and moving their trading operation. This did not stop the Comanche expansion, though. They expanded into the Texas plains. Now they ranged from the Pecos River to Cross Timbers and from the Red River to the Balcones and Scarp. The mounted buffalo chase was the backbone of their economy. Gathering would decrease. Eating fish was a taboo, and fowl became an emergency food source. The buffalo became the basic, fundamental caloric unit of the Comanche diet. This meant growing horse herds was an imperative. Spanish Texas offered the opportunity of poorly guarded, well-horsed missions and even more wild horses. 1740s revealed another coalition between the Spanish Texas and the Lipan Apaches. In 1749, the two groups had made peace, and the Spanish hoped to create a buffer between the colony and the Comanches. The Tauvoya expulsion caused the French to refocus their trading operation to the lower Red River. First, the Comanches integrated themselves into the existing alliance network, though, allying with the Tauvoyas, Tonkawas, and the Hacianais, who were concerned that the Spanish-Lipan alliance would push them out. The war against the Lipan was a near repeat of the last conflict with the Apaches, complete with the Lipans turning to the Spanish for aid in exchange for conversion. The goal of this Comanche attacks in Texas was to show their far-reaching political and trade ties, their power, and to encourage the Spanish to cut support for the Apaches. The Lipan, realizing the Spanish could not help, fled south. The Spanish continued the war despite the rationale not being there. In 1760, they ceased active hostilities, though. However, the Spanish refused to pick a side between the Comanches and the Apaches. Thus, a raiding war began. It was in this time, and the decade or so that to follow, that the raiding would peak in New Mexico. By 1766, they nearly destroyed the Texas colony and forced the Lipans to the Texas coast, the desert around the Rio Grande Valley, and the Coahuila. Marquis de Ruby, who we will talk about in the future, was the one who gave Texas a kick in the pants to make peace. In 1769, they did take a conciliatory stance towards the Comanches. With the Lipans beaten, the Comanches now controlled most of the southern plains. The Spanish had failed to stop the spread of European technology to the plains, As they expanded, the Comanches forged key alliances that left their enemies divided and defenseless, while strengthening the Comanche position. They even forged ties with Spanish subjects to wage war against Spain, such as the Tausenos. Their alliance with the Pawnees, Tauveyas, Tonkawas, Hassanais, and French Louisiana turned their domain into a nexus point, trade that marginalized the Spanish and the Apaches. Their commitment to mounted nomadic life also gave them an edge. Few, if any, societies have been so dependent on a single food source. By 1750, it is estimated that their population was somewhere between 10 to 15,000 people. France ceding many of her colonial possessions in 1763, though, the balance would change. Now it was British East and Spanish West, divided by the Mississippi watershed. This sale to the Spanish ignored the realities on the ground in Texas. Spanish tried to use French-style tactics to absorb those on the edges of their actual domain. Comanche policy shifted to bend bordering regions to their will. Because of the Spanish failure to account for Comanche ascendancy, their frontier regions in Comanche territory would be hollowed out, imperial possessions of the Comanches in all but name, as the Comanches forged their empire. The Spanish expected that with New Mexico being the only choice for obtaining European-made goods now, Comanches would be forced to comply with their demands. Comanches, however, would continue to seek allies and trade partners where they could, opening up opportunities for them to pull away from the Spanish. The Comanches were a natural party to look for building a horse herd. They re-established trading ties with the Wichitas, who got guns from British contraband traders. French merchants still in Louisiana continued to trade with the Comanches despite Spanish bans. The rise of the Upper Arkansas as a trade center allowed the Comanches to break free from the Spanish trade embargo. By 1767, they are better armed than the Spanish in areas like New Mexico. By 1780, they were even exporting guns to other tribes. They even started to sell guns to New Mexicans. Overall, they had begun to displace New Mexico as the primary economic, political, and military power in the Southwest. However, peace would be fleeting as always, and if you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled ENGINEERINGFIRE.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.